I think my favorite thing about my job is that every project, has its own, requirements and needs and style. You don't, even though you keep designing costumes and you keep creating characters, it's a different project every time. It doesn't really get that repetitive or that boring. I originally got involved in costume design because I had an older sister that studied lighting design for theater. And I was still in high school when she was studying lighting design. And she had to, as part of her coursework, she had to take some costume design classes. And whenever she would come home, she would say, "Carolyn, you should do costume design." And I, at the time I was, into gymnastics and dance and art, and I didn't really have much of a focus. And so, it kind of naturally progressed. So I got my degrees in theatrical costume design, for stage and opera and dance, but I took all my electives in film classes. Because at that time, I think it's still true of some universities that you can't, most costume designers come out of like the theater arts programs and not so much the film programs. So when I was finished with school at the University of Illinois, I moved out to Los Angeles with some of my college friends. And, of course, there's always the mystery of how do you get your foot in the door. And my first job, I worked at a store called International Silks and Woolens, which is a gigantic, beautiful, old-style fabric store in LA that many of the costume designers used to, shop there. So I met a few costume designers that way. And I also did some temping where you were basically doing, clerical work or answering phones. But they would just send you to different production companies. I was answering phones for one of the producers at New Line Cinema for a while. After I'd been there a long time, he was finally like, "So what do you want to do?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm a costume designer." And he's like, "Why did you not tell me?" And so he hooked me up with some costume designers. I was almost hired on Nightmare on Elm Street 5. And then production pushed on that, and that costume designer felt so bad because she'd sort of hired me and then had to say, "Oh, it pushed," and so there was no job there for a while. And then a few months later, she called me back because she was the costume designer on Twin Peaks. So I got to just be the low man on the totem pole on that show, and it was a great learning process to just start at the bottom and sort of work your way up over the years. And I did end up on the TV series Freddy's Nightmares, which was kind of, again, connected to the whole New Line Cinema connection. My title on Twin Peaks, my actual working title, was that I was just a costumer. So it was sort of a catch-all phrase. So there was, the basic structures. You have the costume designer and assistant costume designers, and then wardrobe supervisors they keep track of all the filming and all the continuity, and they're usually in charge of like the set costumers and the key costumers and the trailer costumers. And, depending on what show you're on, it could be the costume designer plus 3 people, or it could be the costume designer plus, 19 or 20. Like when I worked on the first season of Yellowstone that had a gigantic wardrobe department. And I worked on the Utah unit for Fallout. When I did my start paperwork on that, there was a button you could click where you could, see the rest of the crew. And I was like, oh my gosh, what a big crew. I was like the 103rd person to do my digital paperwork. And when I clicked through, I realized I was the 103rd person on the wardrobe crew because they built all of those things, and they had a unit in New York, and they had a unit in Africa, and they had a unit in Utah. So really, a wardrobe crew can be anywhere from 2 people to apparently 103. I think that's the biggest wardrobe crew I've ever been on. But that counts all the tailors who are building in the costume houses in New York and all of that. It kind of depends on if you're early on in shooting or later in shooting, but by the time cameras are rolling, about 60% of my work is done. So much of my work is pre-production, but once we're filming, especially if you're on a feature film, it's not like every actor starts, sometimes you can have casts, upward, 60, 70, 80 people. So I'm continually in the process of still doing fittings, with cast members who haven't started their shooting process yet. And most shows, most wardrobe departments, it's kind of split into two sections. You have the costume designer and the assistant costume designer, and the shoppers and the tailors and the seamstresses are all like very attached at the hip, sort of like creating the product. And then you have the wardrobe supervisors they're almost more the boss of set per se than I am. So they are making sure that the right people are in the right place at the right time, and the right clothes are in the right rooms. And as you know, they shoot films out of order, and it's basically location based. If they've already have all the lights set up in the kitchen set or whatever, they're going to do every kitchen scene. So the actors, they're acting in day 1 of the script, and then they're acting in day 10 of the script, and then they're acting in day 7 of the script. And and sometimes you work on shows where they'll do multiple episodes at a time. So, it takes a lot of people to pay attention to that kind of continuity. Block shooting is a little bit of an exception. I mean, the rule is you're usually doing one feature film or one episode of television at a time. It's really a team effort. I do really appreciate that somehow the universe delivered to me that I've really personally worked in every department. And I do think that helps, that every level of the wardrobe department. It helps when you're a costume designer who really knows what the set costumers need and what the wardrobe supervisor needs. And it's not just all about creating a beautiful look, unless you want daily chaos. You have to also be good at budgeting and crew management. And there's a lot, I love the creative element of my job, but I would say about 30 to 40% of my job is creative, and 50 to 60% of it is crew management and budgeting and the stuff that is not fun, that they don't really teach you about in school, that you have to sort of catch up and just learn about on your own. And it's interesting, the course that I teach at the University of Utah, it's a design for film and television class, but I do make the students do a budget for a script, because I got out of school without ever doing a budget, and it's a hard job. So it's a little dry and it's a little boring, but at least the students that graduate from theater arts at the U are, and the thing is, if you learn how to budget for a wardrobe department, you can probably also budget for the props department or the art department or the hair and makeup department. It's sort of the same idea of how you go about it. So I think that is helpful. While I was living in San Diego, I got a call to interview for a job called Everwood with Warner Brothers that was filming in Salt Lake City. And the irony is I had just been in Salt Lake City to be a spectator for the Olympics. I think it was like a year later or maybe 18 months later, but it was just so interesting to me that I didn't really see why I would ever be in Salt Lake City again, after the Olympics. And then it was just so interesting to be back working on that show. And that show went several seasons. And my son was quite young then, and he started school in Salt Lake City. And I think and he really, went to a great school here in Salt Lake and had a lot of friends. And, I think that sort of started my journey of sort of splitting my time between Utah and Los Angeles. And now these many years later, it is very nice to be able to work in both cities, but I do prefer working in Utah. It's a quite small but sort of robust film community here in Salt Lake City and Utah, so I think I know every wardrobe person that, we all kind of rotate and work on all the same things, which is nice. I think costume design, it requires a lot of finding that balance between sort of being the head of your department and being the leader, but then also it's very much, you have to make sure that the director's very happy and the producers are very happy, and to a certain extent the actors are happy. And there's some bigger, more famous costume designers that I think can strong arm the actors into things more than others of us, but it's really a collaboration. But then you really do kind of have to be the boss of your department. So it's, I think it's like you have to be a very strong leader for your department, but you also have to be very collaborative with the rest of the design team. And you're also, you're working very close with the production designer on color schemes and, and just the whole style and look and what you want things to be. I think there's a lot of good advice that you can give to young people who are starting out, but I think especially now in this like very digital age where everyone has an iPhone and has more access to technology, start telling stories, start making movies, start doing movies. If you really want to be a costume designer, find some friends who have a short story they want to shoot and just do it. It's really, it really is storytelling at its base. And I think anyone who's waiting to get permission to be, fill in the blank, a director, a writer, a producer, a costume designer, a production designer, a script supervisor, if you're waiting to get permission, it's just a different world. You don't have to move to LA and work as a temp at New Line Cinema to get a job. You can promote yourself. Social media has changed everything, and anybody can get the attention of anyone if you want to put it on Instagram and TikTok and